it's taking the rest of us for a heady ride. All right, to discuss this and more, I'm joined from Melbourne by the Head of Research at the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. Daniel, thank you for sharing Freedom Day with us here on Bernardi. You heard what I had to say about greenwashing and the weight of money that's flowing into this. Is every rent seeker now identified a 30-year scheme to enrich themselves while not saving the planet?
Well, it certainly seems that way, Corey, and there's nowhere I'd rather be on Freedom Day than joining you and your audience to this discussion, which is very important. And as you identified in your editorial just then, this is going to help a small group of very well-off elites, while everybody else is going to pay the costs. There was a very significant report released recently by the United Kingdom Treasury. As you know, Boris Johnson is greener than grass when it comes to net zero and the climate zealotry in the UK, but at least their Treasury Department has released some analysis of the cost of this, and it's exactly as you said. It'll be low-income workers and families that are going to pay the price. What that report showed is that high-income earners emit more than 3 times that as low-income earners, but low-income earners are going to pay because you're going to have higher costs for your appliances because of energy efficiency requirements, so that your fridges, your microwaves, your kettles, your toasters, all of those are going to have sweeping regulations to mean that they use less electricity, less energy, jacks up the price. Moving to electric vehicles, you go from a $15,000 petrol car to a $75,000 electric vehicle that nobody really wants to begin with anyway, because there's no market for it in Australia. And then on top of that, in Australia, closing down all the coal-fired power stations, as you say, not replacing them with nuclear, but replacing them with wind and solar, which is going to jack up electricity prices. So a net zero emissions target is not only tremendously expensive in the trillions, as you say, but it's also regressive, hitting the low-income earners the hardest.
And look, let's face the facts. We've had officials here say if we cut our emissions to zero, it'll make no difference to the climate. We've had John Kerry say that about America. So if any change is to take place, it needs to be global. But we know that China's not going to do it. Xi's not even going to this climate shindig in Glasgow. We know that Putin's not going there. They're laughing at the West as we pursue these insane schemes, aren't they?
They certainly are, Corey. Just to build on your point about China, we know that every 16 days, China emits more carbon than Australia does in one entire year. So that puts it into perspective that China is by far the single largest emitter of carbon in the world. What Australia does makes no noticeable difference. But there's also, I think, a much bigger issue taking place, Corey, which is, I think, that the lockdowns and now net zero, we're seeing a transition of Australia from a democratic capitalist society to a feudal serfdom society, where it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to start their own business, get a decent, well-paid, stable job, and to be able to provide for their family and to live in a flourishing community. Now, those were the linchpins of the Australian way of life in the post-World War II era. It was underpinned by having, well-paid, stable jobs. But we know, and our research has documented, that net zero emissions target will overwhelmingly destroy well-paid full-time jobs, like in mining and manufacturing, and replace those jobs with low-paid, part-time, unstable work in the renewable sector. So there is a much broader transition taking place across the Western world, and a net zero emissions target is a part of that acceleration of the transfer of wealth from lower income working class to the elites.
Yes, it's a really interesting point, Daniel. I'm actually really pleased you raised it, because over the last 18 months during the lockdowns, we've seen people comply with some of the most crazy sort of determinations that are not based on health. We've seen elected premiers hiding behind unelected officials and granting them full authority. I mean, by the time the South Australian election comes around, the police commissioner will have been in charge of the state longer than the elected premier, and that's just maddening. But when you've got people that are that compliant, what better time to force them into a global scheme which will empower the unelected bureaucrats, empower the elites, that will see more money printing and basically keep the people in a state of serfdom, I think was the term that you used. But it all just seems to be following a narrative that people are losing their democratic rights to the woke mob or the bullying internationalists.
Well, we are. I mean, a vote today means a lot less than it did in the past. Not only are the differences between the major parties much less than what was the case in times gone by, but we have less influence over the major events taking place in our lives. There's the unelected bureaucrats that you mentioned, which we've seen throughout COVID, but there's also the internationalisation of public policy, and we've seen that with net zero. Most vividly, I think we can see who's in favour of net zero. Well, the big banks and the international financiers. We know that the big media conglomerates are in favour of it. International organisations like the OECD and the United Nations. The major political parties are in favour of it. The only people not in favour of it are working class Australians who said no in 2013 and no in 2019. They said no to a carbon tax when Abbott won in a landslide, and they said no to Labor's emissions target of 45% in 2019 because of the impact that was going to have on their jobs. And now Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party are adopting Labor's policy and saying it's going to be good for them. You know, this is how our democracy has changed so much in just 2 years' time.
Yeah, and they're making decisions that the rest of us and future taxpayers are going to have to be paying for many years to come. Daniel Wild, thank you for your insights today, and keep up the great work at the Institute of Public Affairs. It's an amazing outfit down there, so thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, Corey.